Welcome to the June 17th, 2024 meeting for the Planning Commission, Lake Stevens Planning Commission. If we can all rise for the pledge.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay. I know Commissioner Jennifer Davis, she has obligations in Eastern Washington. She's not able to attend this evening. Commissioner Morton?
Here.
Present. Commissioner Dewar?
Here.
Right, Commissioner Packard?
Present.
Commissioner Huxford?
Yes.
And Commissioner Holt?
Here.
Everybody else is here.
We make a motion to excuse Jennifer Davis. I make a motion.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
That so moves. Move on to guest business. Do you have anybody that like to share anything with the commission? Here to listen. Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate y'all being here. Okay, that moves us to the approval of the minutes from June 3rd. Everybody get the opportunity to take a look at those. Any amendments? Can I get a motion to approve the minutes from the June 3rd meeting?
That we approve the minutes from the last meeting. Second those.
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, so moved. That brings us to Mr. Levitan and the land use open house.
All right, thank you, Chair Davis. I'm going to pull up a PowerPoint. Okay. All right, so I am David Levitan, Senior Planner, and we are here tonight to discuss a variety of topics related to land use and housing. This will follow a pretty similar format to the meeting that you held on June 3rd, where we discussed transportation and capital facilities. So I have a PowerPoint presentation. It kind of goes over a couple different topic areas, so I'll probably stop periodically to see if there are any questions, either from commissioners, the members of the public that are here or online are welcome to raise their hands, and kind of, we want this to be interactive, so there will be some opportunities for that. So if there aren't, if there isn't a natural break, feel free to raise your hand or just note into the microphone that you have questions. Happy to answer as we go along. So just a little bit of a meeting overview. So we're going to be talking about the city's growth targets for 2044, which are largely driving the comprehensive plan update. Talk a little bit about some potential map amendments that will be needed to accommodate growth, specifically at lower income housing levels, and then also to meet our 20-year employment needs. Attachment 1 and 2 in your packet tonight are draft goals and policies that have been updated, specifically related to the land use element, which is chapter 2, and the housing element, which is chapter 3 of the comprehensive plan. Those are shown as track changes. And then gonna allow for both public and commissioner comments. So just a little bit on the growth targets. We've seen these before. So basically, over the next 20 years, the city is required to show that it has the capacity to accommodate about 48,565 people, about an additional 3,200 jobs, so about almost 9,000 total jobs by 2044, and then not quite 5,000 additional housing units. As we've discussed before, this does go back to 2020. So we do get credit for the growth that we've experienced over the last 3 to 4 years, especially on the housing side. We have experienced significant housing growth, well over 1,000 units. We've actually also seen about 1,000 new jobs. So we are have done a pretty good job just within the last few years of meeting about a quarter of our projected growth, both for housing and then actually more about a third of our projected growth for employment, not quite a third, about 30%. So we have done a pretty good job, and that is factored into our growth targets. So just as far as how the city must plan for growth, first and foremost, we are required to show that we have adequate zone capacity for our population, job, and housing growth targets. We're able to develop reasonable measures to help meet that growth. So outside of the map amendments, those are things such as policies and programs, code amendments, increases in density, things along those lines, reasonable measures. And then goals and policies, which are really to guide the city over the next 20 years. They provide the policy framework for accommodating the growth targets and growing and developing in a way that is reflective of the Lake Stevens community. So this may be a little bit hard to see from there, but basically this is showing the Growth Management Act was amended in 2021, specifically related to housing needs. Previously, the Growth Management Act read kind of pretty, I don't know if I would term it kind of generically, but basically that the cities and various jurisdictions need to meet housing needs of the community. With House Bill 1220 back in 2021, it amended the language within the Growth Management Act specifically related to the housing element, that cities are required to plan for growth at a variety of different, across a variety of different housing types at a variety of different income levels. And so this is a process that's done collaboratively through Snohomish County tomorrow. So we work with other jurisdictions within Snohomish County to project growth at different income levels over the next 20 years. That's allocated to individual jurisdictions. And then it's broken out by income levels as a percentage of area median income. So the area median income in Snohomish County as of May of 2024 was about $150,000 for a family of four. So up to 100% of AMI would be, and then it's adjusted based off of household size. But kind of that family of four is kind of where the main number comes from and then is adjusted. So if you look at all of these different bars in the bar chart, it shows there on the far right, kind of the dark blue is 120% or more of AMI. So for a family of four, that would be about $180,000 per year. That's about 1,900 of our required 4,900 units. So about 40% of our projected growth is at kind of that 120% or more of area median income. We have about 450 units that are between 100 and 120% of AMI. So if you look up at kind of at the top in black, it shows different housing types. So for 120% and above of AMI, it assumes that that growth is going to be accommodated through detached single family residences. For incomes that are between 100 and 120%, and this comes from the state, is that the city should be planning to accommodate that growth through duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, townhomes, cottage housing. So a little bit lower on the income range that does not utilize a detached single family residential. And then we actually do not have any projected housing needs between 80 and 100% of AMI. So there is no bar for that income range. It shows basically when you calculate it, it shows that we have an existing surplus based on our current supply of housing. But about half of our needs are at or below 80% of AMI. So moving kind of left to right, you see the orange, which is extremely low income, which is 0 to 30%. That shows about 712 units, about 450 units, and that's for what's called permanent supportive housing. So when you have 0 to 30% income range, the state splits that between what's called permanent supportive housing, which is kind of housing that's integrated with supportive services primarily aimed at households with disabilities. And then the non-permanent supportive housing is lower, extremely low income households that are not qualified as permanent supportive housing. When you look at the yellow bar, that's 30 to 50%. So that would be up to about $75,000 per year for a family of four. That's about 820 units. And then when you get up to 50 to 80% of AMI, that's about 550 units. And so 80% of 150 would be up to about $120,000 per year for a family of four. And for that 0 to 80%, the state guidance is that we should be looking at apartments, condos, and accessory dwelling units as far as the potential housing supply to meet that housing demand. So that when we're factoring in potential map amendments and policies, we need to be aiming to provide these different types of housing to accommodate the needs at these different housing income ranges. Sorry, at these household income ranges. Does anybody have any questions on that before we move on? It's kind of a pretty dense topic. All right. So this is just another slide to show the city's housing capacity as calculated within the housing needs analysis that was done as part of the Housing Action Plan back in 2023. Showed that the city has just about 5,000 units of zone capacity. So that exceeds our projected need of 4,900 units over the next 20 years. But as you can see, the bulk of that, when you look at that kind of the yellow bar, about 3/4 of that estimated supply is for detached single-family residences, and that doesn't match with the housing needs of the community over the next 20 years. So basically, we need to be looking for opportunities for potential map amendments or policies or programs to encourage additional development of housing types that meet the needs of especially those households in Lake Stevens that will be making at or below 80% of area median income. So basically $120,000 per year or less for a family of four, and then adjusted based off of household size. And so we had shared a map back in February when we first kind of started talking about land use and housing and economic development and the growth targets in general. That's included as attachment 5 in the packet tonight. And so basically staff has looked around and worked with our consultants to look for opportunities to accommodate this growth within housing types that meet the needs of these lower income ranges. We basically need to meet those needs below 80% of AMI and then also find additional capacity for employment, either through map amendments or through additional reasonable measures as far as, things like potential increases in, employment density, basically programs or policies that will help to meet that growth. Just to preface this conversation, so we've identified these as potential map amendments. These are not set in stone yet until we basically kind of create our preferred alternative as part of the overall draft comprehensive plan. It would be at that point that we would reach out to property owners. We do reach out, we don't just make these changes. We are required by city code to be reaching out to property owners to let them know that there are potential amendments as part of this comprehensive plan update.
I have a quick question there.
Yeah.
So for residents that are notified that they're going to be in a more dense zone, would they then be able to subdivide their property, say, and or develop, tear down, like say there's an old house on a lot, they'd be able to tear it down, subdivide, and build two houses and to replace it?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on which zone it's currently in and what it would be changed to as far as what the additional potential development capacity. We already in most of our residential zones, allow for middle housing, so duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes. You can do a duplex on most lots that allow a detached single family residence. And then with slightly larger lot sizes, you can do triplexes and fourplexes. We just adopted our code that we went through last winter to kind of codified the requirements of House Bills 1110 related to middle housing and then 1337 related to accessory dwelling units. So we've already kind of increased the infill housing supply. But if it were to go to multifamily residential, yeah, most of these areas would have additional development opportunities and additional development capacity.
So in that letter to those residents, would they be, most people would have no idea. They go, oh, okay, my zoning's changed. They'd have no idea. Would they be given any kind of like, like some like overview of what that really means to them, what they could actually do with their property, because people may not think of that right away.
Yeah, and Russ, I don't know if in the past how extensive we've gotten in with potential land use and zoning map amendments, but it would be possible as part of that letter to note that, your property is proposed to go from this to this, and these are maybe some additional permissible uses within.
Yeah,
So-
some education would be good there.
Yeah, we can definitely do education, but we also have to be careful because we don't want to give people legal or property advice on what they can do. So, I mean, we can set, the basic terms. This is what the difference means, but I would be pretty hesitant to give recommendations on what the individual carrying capacity of any property was outside of a more formal process.
I think potentially we could at least point to, the code without getting into the specifics that, for additional information on permissible uses or something like that, that might be possible, so that we're just letting them know that, these are the rules that apply, as opposed to providing them guidance or advice. Yeah, if you're okay with that.
Yeah, if you don't mind to step up to the podium, just tell us your name and your address. That'd be great. Thank you, sir.
Make sure the light is on the green.
Oh,
light
yeah.
on-
If you hold the button,
On the base.
You got to press and hold it.
press it, hold it for a second until it turns green.
Red now.
And then, yeah, once it turns red, yeah, there you go.
Just push without holding off. It was red.
Now you can let go.
Okay, good. I'm Courtney Williams and my address is 11705 7th Place Southeast, Lake Stevens, 98258. Been a resident for 28 years in Lake Stevens, raised my family here. I'm wondering if HB 1110 and 1337 have already been codified into the Lake Stevens Code.
They have been.
They have been. Okay, great. So does that mean that you could actually file a project now using those codes?
Yeah, you would be able to. That was adopted. It became effective, I believe, at the end of February. So that our code does comply with House Bill 1110 and 1337. So you can build a duplex on most lots that are zoned for detached single-family residences. And then we do allow for up to 2 ADUs per lot per 1337.
Right. So the population of Lake Stevens, what is the population?
41,563.
63. I can't see the board. So so HB 1110 was up to a fourplex on a single family lot, zoned 1 to 4, if the population is between 25 and 75,000 and the infrastructure is appropriate.
It's for a duplex for cities with between 25,000 and 75,000. So up to 2 units per lot. You have to be over 75,000 to be required to allow up to 4 units by right. We are required, if at least one of the units is affordable, then we are required to allow up to 4 units per lot. But we're a tier 2 city as opposed to a tier 1 city.
What does that mean?
So a tier 2, so basically there are cities like Seattle and Tacoma and Bellevue that are required, basically, whereas we have to allow a duplex on any lot that allows a detached single family residence. The bigger cities, the tier 1 cities, are required to allow up to the 4 units. So basically the House bill kind of changed. It started with cities like Lake Stevens and Edmonds and Linwood. That would have been required to provide up to those 4 units. Then it went down to 3 units. Then it went down to 2 units. So it was it shifted several times from when it was first.
Where did
introduced.
it shift? Because I have the bill that was passed by the state. The bill that was passed by the state.
It was.
25 to 75,000 was 1 to 4 units per single family lot.
So
For
this
population.
conversation's getting a little far from our topic tonight. So if you want to have
Okay.
particular conversation about your properties with David outside of this venue, I think would be great, but we're getting a little off
Okay.
of the
All
basic
right.
presentation this evening.
Do I hit the button again?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If
And-
I may, please?
Yeah.
Jump in with a quick question. Mine's kind of the opposite question. So if I have property in Lake Stevens and I choose not to build on it, but I want to improve the existing house that's on there, let's say. Is it going to, and I asked this back in February and it was still kind of, we were settling in with some of the things that had been passed and sent our way from Olympia. Is it going to be, am I going to be restricted at all in keeping the land use as it is now if I want to improve it without building duplexes or ADUs?
So yeah, I mean, it depends which zone you're going to and what the permissible use table says and whether it would be creating a legal non-conforming situation. So if it went from a zone that's say permitted detached single-family residences to not permitting detached single-family residences, you would be able to maintain and repair the existing home, but you would be limited as far as future development opportunities for detached single-family residences, say if you were to subdivide. But that's kind of speaking in hypotheticals as far as,
There are some landowners that don't want what's being
Mhm.
forced upon the city and want to maintain that green space around them, the acreage around them. Now, when they sell someday, so be it, but right now they don't want to have that around. Is the city at all going to restrict their ability to maintain their property as it is today?
no, we basically, and this is a good conversation to have, we're required to show zone capacity. We're not required to make anyone build it. So we're not going to be pursuing people and saying, hey, you're zoned multifamily residential now, like, let's get on it and build us an apartment building. Like we won't be doing that. We're required statutorily to show that we have the zone capacity and the policies and programs in place that would allow for people to develop, but we are not going to make them develop.
I sat through the presentation that city council sat through a couple months ago, that a lot of this data was drawn from. And I understand the enthusiasm, if I can use that word, to meet criteria. But at the same time, and I say this every meeting, Lake Stevens is unique in that we have a lake in the middle of us and property that is not conducive to low income because it's expensive property. And so my concern being if people want to maintain that park-like feel that a lot of Lake Stevens hopefully will continue to have for a long time, that I want enthusiasm for that as well.
Yeah, and I totally understand that. In a kind of the locational choices or the criteria that we're including includes things like proximity to transit and services and things along those lines, which generally are not right along the lakefront. And so those have been factored in as far as some of the, potential map amendments are more focused on areas, either adjacent to commercial or adjacent to transit or that provide kind of a buffer between, commercial areas and residential areas. So that has been incorporated kind of into some of the locational criteria that we're utilizing.
But the wording did change in the document, I think it's one, to include waterfront. The wording is included in your waterfront residential.
Oh, the waterfront as far as duplexes?
And it goes farther. So the wording, and I don't have it in front of me right now, but the wording that you included with each of the
Land use designation.
designations is also included in waterfront. And that was one of my questions that I wanted to bring up tonight later.
Yeah.
Simply to say, was that intentional? Because I thought that we had that conversation about waterfront and its usage and the ability to be affordable on waterfront property. I think that that's a misleading. It gives hope to an area of the town that is not going to be conducive to low-income property.
When you get back home to your notes, if you can just share that policy number or page number that
Absolutely.
you're looking at would be more helpful, and then we can
Got it.
speak to the intent of that section.
Perfect.
Yeah, and that would be within attachment one, the land use policy. So even if you want to kind of scroll through that, and you might be able to find it. So yeah, happy to speak to that, especially as we review the land use and housing policies.
And David, follow up, the question I've had is actually about parks. As we're, adding in more dense residential, what component does, expansion of parks is, when I hear, family of 4 with an income of $80,000 to $100,000, and we're looking at almost exclusively meeting that demand with apartments and condominiums. What is the, if any plan is there to ensure that we integrate an expansion of our parks?
I can answer that. So in 2013 and then reaffirmed in 2019, in our parks plans, it sets the level of service standard for parks. That will also be coming back to you next year. It's on a 6-year cycle. So currently our level of service for parks is based on access and proximity to different levels of parks. And so we'll have to reassess whatever the Recreation Conservation Office is doing, if the methodology we're currently using is still the appropriate methodology for this community, but it is about proximity to parks. And then through development, there is a park impact fee, and it varies between multifamily, single family, what is charged, and that goes into park construction. So, so there is a metric and a level of service for creating new park
Big tents. Okay. All right. Thank you.
or
Director.
building new park facilities.
That makes sense. Thank you. Oh, ma'am, if you don't mind, just to step up and just, yeah, if you don't mind, just give us your name and your address. We appreciate you.
Hi, I'm Janice Thompson. When you talk about the parks and the higher density, like that gentleman, Mr. Davis was talking about, some of these developments now are putting parks, small park areas within the, so does that offset having to provide like open space parks? Because they're really just kind of just lots.
So the answer varies. So with private developments, there is a level of service standard for what we call mini parks. So those are your smallest level neighborhood parks, usually focused on a particular neighborhood. And so it does satisfy the need for that neighborhood individually. So that is part of our calculation, but those do not come into the city's system. And there are some mini parks that are owned by the city that we can look to create those facilities if they're lacking through a private neighborhood.
All right, great. So I'm just going to show a couple of examples that have been identified on the map. The first one is one that was brought before the Planning Commission for the first time back in 2022. There was a discussion as far as looking within the 20th Street Southeast Corridor sub-area, opportunities to increase both housing and employment capacity. It was at that point that both the Planning Commission and the City Council wanted to wait until the 2024 update, which we're obviously in now, to look at it more holistically within the overall needs as opposed to just the needs of the sub-area. So this is an area on the east side of 99th Avenue Southeast, just north of 20th Street Southeast, that that staff has identified as having, potential capacity to accommodate several hundred additional units of multifamily residential. It's right along 20th Street Southeast. There's a transit line that comes down 99th that connects to the greater Seattle area. So factored that in. There's proximity to some commercial services, and we continue to build out and focus employment growth within one of the kind of the 20th Street Southeast corridor being one of our 3 adopted sub areas where we plan on accommodating a lot of our employment growth. So it seemed to make sense as far as this site or these sites, this area of the city. So this is currently zoned RA 12 which allows for a variety of detached single-family residential and middle housing types, including townhomes. This would expand it to allow for apartments that would meet the capacity needs of lower income households, while also still allowing for some of the middle housing types that have kind of been being developed there as well. So we've identified, so that's the area that's shown in black with the brown hatch marks. There are a couple potential additions to this. We had kind of gone back and forth as far as on the west side, the red box with the 1 in it would be the west side of 99th. So those are kind of smaller lots, would really probably need to be consolidated or aggregated to allow for a larger project. If you go further north on the west side of 99th, you start to really run into some critical areas. And so we are not proposing at this point to do that because we don't think there would be a whole lot of additional capacity. So kind of a question for Planning Commission is if they think it would be appropriate to explore that to potentially expand to the west side. And then if you look at the box in the horizontal box in number 2, which is within the larger kind of brown hatch mark, that's an area that has frontage along 20th. So would it make more sense to, instead of changing that from RA12, basically the land use designation and the corresponding zoning from, primarily single family and medium density residential, changing that to commercial to allow for some additional commercial development. So it's a question of, we have needs for both multifamily housing and additional commercial areas to accommodate employment. So any planning commission feedback on that as far as whether that would make more sense to be commercial versus multifamily would be welcome.
Option 2 seems to make more sense to me.
Well, I thought that was already asked and answered when we did the 20th sub area. That was the focus of that whole corridor, was to make it as much commercial as possible.
It was, but it was assigned the RA12 zoning and maintain the residential land use designation. So that was something it really makes sense now that the sub area is about 12 years old now, and you typically revisit them, and we're revisiting the sub areas as part of this comprehensive plan update. So would it make sense to change that land use designation to commercial? There is obviously, on the south side, it's pretty much continuous along 20th. On the north side, it kind of goes from commercial to residential to commercial again, kind of skips around a little bit. So, any thoughts from the Planning Commission on that before we kind of finalize the draft proposal?
Just a quick question on perhaps a third option. Is that a spot where like a mixed use residential might make sense with commercial on the bottom and residential above?
As far as number 2?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, we could look at that as well.
In our commercial district is a mixed use zone. It's not called that, but it allows residential on top. But if we particularly wanted mixed use, the adjacent properties next door do have a mixed use designation, but they developed as solely multifamily. So I think we might be more successful going to, if you want the mix, to the commercial designation.
I see.
All right. And so this is an area within pretty much a stone's throw of here, just to the north of here. So this is basically the western edge of the downtown Lake Stevens sub area. It currently has a land use and zoning designation of mixed use, which doesn't allow quite the same levels of commercial or residential development as the rest of downtown. So basically kind of everything east of 123rd that has that central business district and that commercial land use designation. So this is an area with potential capacity to accommodate some additional multifamily and employment growth if it were to be changed to that central business designation. We've shown it extending. There are a number of kind of long parcels, especially on the north side of 20th here, kind of that extend up all the way, further to the north, kind of showing this upper area up here. And So we've basically proposed, what this is showing is changing that land use designation and the corresponding zoning from mixed use to commercial and central business district. And then that box number 1 is a question of whether would it make sense to slightly adjust the boundaries, expand the boundaries of the downtown sub area, basically to pick up a couple of additional parcels, basically square off that area that's there in the northwest corner. And so there's a little bit of multifamily, but still primarily single family in nature. So that's just a question for the Planning Commission, one, whether they support kind of bumping up the existing land use designations that are mixed use up to CBD and commercial district, and then 2, whether it would make sense to expand that a little bit.
And maybe just I'll add the difference between the central business district and mixed use. They are both mixed use zones. And as David said, there's a little bit more flexibility in the central business district as far as either vertical or horizontal mixed use. So for example, you could do commercial frontage along the roadway and then just go to straight apartments in the back. Whereas if in the current mixed use zone, it would require the vertical mixed use throughout the entire complex. So just a little bit more flexibility in that. And again, as we look at the boundaries, and you'll see in the goals and policies, one of the policies did identify that we need to look for additional denser housing options in the downtown core. And so by looking at that area 1 would satisfy that kind of requirement. Again, looking both at it from a jobs perspective and a housing perspective. And these houses would be, if you refer back to the table that David did, would be in that 100 to 120 kind of AMI threshold that we're also looking to satisfy.
All right.
Well, I mean, yeah, for what it's worth, I think it makes sense that that property, what's, boxed in number 1, that has been it's a vacant strip that's been for sale at times. That really just makes sense for it to be incorporated into the business district. Yeah, highest and best use.
All right. And then this is a pretty straightforward one. This is basically the Lake Stevens Industrial Center. And so currently there are 2 different land use designations, general and light industrial, with 2 corresponding zoning designations. If you remember from the Lake Stevens Industrial Center analysis that was done back in 2022 and 2023, one of the actions and strategies on that was to standardize and consolidate it into 1 land use designation and potentially 1 zoning designation. Doing so would allow for some of the development scenarios that are envisioned within that plan that have the potential to accommodate a lot of our projected employment growth within that area. If there was a greater variety of uses, if it was kind of more, if it didn't kind of jump around between general industrial and light industrial, it would allow for a little bit more wholesale redevelopment, kind of contingent on addressing critical areas constraints and some of the infrastructure constraints that we're looking at addressing through capital improvements and other programs, and obviously just through redevelopment. So this is something that we're proposing to change that to just basically 1 industrial land use designation, just basically as an implementation item from that Lake Stevens Industrial Center analysis. And then in attachment 5, there are a number of areas that aren't really called out to accommodate additional capacity per se. A lot of them are already developed. They're more to clean up the map to basically provide zoning and land use designations that are consistent with the existing uses and with surrounding uses. So this is an example of a couple of multifamily residential properties that are either zoned mixed use neighborhood, or the one on the south that's zoned R6, that obviously is not consistent with the existing development. It is right adjacent to downtown, on the southern edge of downtown. So we felt like it made sense to change those to the multifamily residential designations. So that there's a series of those on attachment 5 as well, some existing apartment complexes that are zoned either R6 or even zoned R4 or RA12. And so basically cleaning those up. Some of the benefits of that is that we would get credit for some of that additional zone capacity. And so that's just something to basically to harmonize existing development with our projected land use designations, or our adopted land use designations, I should say. So yeah, if there are any questions about the maps, that was kind of the overview of some of the map amendments and the thought process behind them. Basically, the second half of the presentation is focused on the goals and policies that are included within attachments 1 and 2. So happy to answer any remaining questions on some of the map amendments, or we can kind of come back to those at the end after we do some of the goal and policy review. Whatever planning commission's preference is. Just want to keep going.
Yeah, let's keep going.
Okay. So yeah, so attachment includes track changes version of the land use goals and policies. So we've tried to just categorize. Is there somebody online trying to talk?
My apologies, Russell Joe. I was off mute. My apologies.
Oh, no worries. So yeah, so attachment 1 is the land use policies. So as Commissioner Huxford pointed to, so some of these are related to basically establishing and kind of describing the various land use designations. There are some minor changes that are proposed in those, basically to cover some of the changes in state law through the House bills through 1110, basically that requires areas even like with the land use designation of waterfront residential, they are still required to allow up to duplexes. And so I think that was one of the minor changes within the description for the waterfront residential land use designation, was to add in 2 household residences or duplexes. I would need to pull it open. But we made kind of some minor changes to those land use designations, but really a lot of the focus was on addressing some of the other state mandates as far as addressing things like sustainability and affordability, and then some of the specific requirements of House Bill 1220, which deals with things as more so when we get into the housing goals and policies as opposed to land use, but dealing with things like racially disparate impacts, basically impacts that have affected minority households more than non-Hispanic white households. And then also the potential downfalls of redevelopment that can result in displacement of existing residents and businesses. So developing some policy language related to that. But as far as some of the new goals and policies that are proposed within the land use element, so attachment 1, chapter 2 of the comprehensive plan are basically things like encouraging and allowing a diverse mix of housing types, considering and evaluating UGA expansions. We, as a reminder, we had proposed several of part of the county's 2024 docket. There's some kind of minor amended versions that are still being considered in some of the alternatives, but largely the county recommended against those. And then encouraging home occupations to help meet future employment needs. So those are all within goal 2.1. The land use designations and permitted uses, as I spoke to, a lot of those changes are specifically allowed to basically note that these additional housing types are allowed within these land use designations and their corresponding zoning designations to be consistent with state law. And then we are proposing to eliminate the planned business district. So that's the area kind of north of where the temporary library is, kind of off of Grade Road. And then there are a couple other areas. It's been a hard to implement land use designation and zone. It probably makes more sense. We've seen more interest for either multifamily residential or standalone commercial, but are proposing to get rid of that. So we would be removing that from the land use designations and most likely going to multifamily residential. So that's, another area that we're looking at as far as potential map amendments. So are there any questions about those?
So to clarify, I know that was part of the downtown, it might be the downtown redevelopment plan, but there was beautification along Grade Road to turn it into one of these welcoming corridors. How does that, how does that add
goal
up?
does not change.
That does not change. Okay, I just want to, yeah.
That would be more like the capital improvements component and the general beautification of the area, which, the specific zoning wouldn't alter.
And with the PBD that Dave spoke about, there's really only two remaining locations in the city. There's the site off Grade Road. That one we would probably recommend to go to some sort of residential designation. The other one is off 92, and we would probably recommend that go to a commercial
And
designation.
I know grade in 92, there was discussion about our favorite topic, storage units. Is that dead in the water at this point?
That project is on life support.
Good.
I don't know what the ultimate outcome is going to be.
Okay, I like the life support part of it though. All right, thank you.
It was this, I'm sorry, everything else downloaded except for this, part of the packet. So, I had three things that stood out in my mind in reading through. One was the wording that was attached to every single, housing type, and it was, something to do with equitable, to use your word. You look at me when you look at say storage units, and I look at
Yep.
you when I say equitable. Because we always talk about the same things. But there was wording put in every single land use, every single group of zoning, including waterfront. And I thought that the wording specifically with waterfront was not conducive to what we've discussed with waterfront property and then the values that has. So that was one. Two, and full disclosure, I own property in the industrial district, so I have to say that. But if we are going to have a vision and change code to make the industrial district someplace that we could do housing and do restaurants and do some of the things that are being outlined in this piece of the packet, then we need to go back in time and make sure that we're cleaning up the air quality out there so that those things would even be feasible.
Sure.
So I have to say it because I live there and it stinks. And then the last one, and it comes up several times in this, and it's been seen in some of the projects that have most recently been approved in the city, are this existing neighborhood versus what is being built in there. And there's a lot of talk in this part of the packet about where not just infill, but where we're going to rezone so that people can build certain types of housing and to accommodate certain levels of income, but to what impact of the already existing neighborhoods that are already there. So if you have a neighborhood that is already existing, but the center of it has the ability to be rezoned, I think that there needs to be some very careful thought into how that's done to accommodate certain levels of income is great, but to do it in a way that, like you say, community transit is available, that there are services that are available. Some of the infill that I was perceiving this affecting would not allow that to happen, would not be conducive to those sort of services. And I think would be detrimental, quite honestly, to the existing residences that are already.
So all of our recommendations for going to a denser residential type, those all really have been thoughtful in looking at, are there services available? Are they in proximity to transit? Are they in proximity to services? So anything that we're proposing that goes to like an apartment type level, definitely making sure that there are reasons to put it there, and those aren't typically going to get plopped down in the middle of a very dense neighborhood. I don't think we're really making other recommendations within existing neighborhoods other than the ones to clean up what's already been built, whether it was under the county, different city land uses at the time. So those were just trying to actually reflect what's there, but that doesn't change the character. And as far as our infill regulations, the commission has already made the recommendations and council acted on those infill regulations. And we have created compatibility to the extent we can, which under state laws, we can't adopt any regulations that are more onerous than the adjacent neighborhoods. So
Understood. Of course, I always try to read it of how people can, how it will be perceived.
absolutely,
Right, and so the intent is one thing, how it will be perceived. is
absolutely.
another. So those were the three that stood out in my mind and going through that.
Okay.
Pushing. Thank you for your.
Yeah, and if I can just speak to policy, I think policy 2.2.1 is where the residential land use designations are described and where there are some changes, and they mention things like say within waterfront residential, allow single family, and then this is an addition, and 2-family residential uses, and that's to be compliant with 1220. That does require duplexes within all of our residential zoning districts. So that was added, and then there were some additional language about, as well, at the very end, recreational uses, as well as permanent supportive housing and transitional housing. So that's another component of 1220, that any zone, any residentially zoned district in any city in Washington has to allow permanent supportive housing and transitional housing. You can't ban it within those residential areas. And so that was just largely from kind of one of the major kind of tenets of the Growth Management Act is consistency between your comprehensive plan and your implementing ordinances, your development code, your zoning code. So trying to provide that policy foundation where you can kind of point to it within the comprehensive plan that this is, there's guidance to allow these types of uses. There's obviously also state law, but, we can strike that language. It doesn't mean that those uses wouldn't be allowed within those zoning districts. We were just trying to provide that kind of crosswalk between the comprehensive plan and the zoning code. So.
Does it read though that it is, that the city is looking for that?
I don't know if it reads that way. I mean, if that's the thoughts of the planning commission and their edits that you think we need to be making, I think just the cost of land within, some of these areas are probably going to make it pretty cost prohibitive to be doing certain types of uses. But, especially if they're depend on any sort of financing or tax credits or things along those lines. But yeah, that wasn't the intent, was to encourage them. It was to note that they are allowed, and it's largely they're allowed because of state law.
And that's all that it really says. It just is a description of what is allowed. It's not affirming or proposing any type of use. It's just saying this is the range of allowances. And I do see the section you're looking at, and I believe it's on page LU2, 2.213. And that is where this new language is introduced. That's a little different than when we had our land use group going back 2018-19, where there was a clear distinction made between what the community wanted to see in waterfront residential. And now we've been preempted a little bit is what Dave is saying. And that's why this new language appears there. So I don't think it's inconsistent, but our mandate has now changed a little bit.
And the reference to limited middle housing is specifically within situations where if somebody wanted to provide an affordable housing unit, under House Bill 1110, you could potentially do up to a 4-plex in the waterfront residential if you do provide at least one affordable housing unit. And that's something that we do not have control over. That's something that comes straight out of House Bill 1110.
Question for you about uses, particularly in the industrial zone. We had discussed previously disallowing certain uses, like say, like marijuana production facilities in the industrial zone. If that's something that the city is looking at or that we can make, formal recommendation for, you know,
I think that will come a little bit later.
Okay.
So we will get through the comprehensive plan and then we will have a whole suite of implementing regulations that we'll want to talk to you about that maybe start at the latter part of this year, beginning of next year.
Right.
But as we consolidate the land use designation for the industrial area based on the infrastructure and market analysis, that laid the groundwork. We'll make the structural changes in the comp plan, and then we would come back with a package of zoning regulations. And I think where the conversation through the market analysis had sort of landed is maybe, I don't think that going to adding residential has a lot of potential there, but I think it was really envisioning it as more of maybe a business park or adding restaurants and more services to make it easier to site more intensive types of jobs and operations there. So I think was the direction we
Yeah.
received, but we'll definitely have an ability to reevaluate that. And I think that goes to what I've heard from two of the commissioners. One, if we want to reimagine that area, we have to control the odors of uses. And that's, septic uses, marijuana uses, potentially other uses. So at some point in the future, we will have to revisit in an objective manner, what are the most intensive uses? And is that where we still want this area to be or not to be in the future? So that will be a conversation I actually look forward to
Yeah.
having, but it's still a few months out.
Great. Thank you.
Just a brief question on, I guess the zoning potential changes. A lot of these changes in here seem to be driven by our need to achieve compliance with the numbers mandates from Olympia. When you have an owner occupied, or I'm sorry, a home occupation, as seen in 2.1.8, does that count as a tick in the box for residential or a tick in the box for commercial or both? Do we get double credit there?
Yeah, my understanding is, you would definitely get credit if somebody's living there. It's not so much like a census of it. It's basically showing your zone capacity especially on the residential side. So if somebody was, say, living in an R6 zone property that was, average size lot and already had a relatively new home from the last couple of decades on it, it's not going to show any capacity for that. And there's not a whole lot of direction at the state level as far to how to account for employment capacity from home occupations. So I wouldn't say it's necessarily a tick. It's more, I think, as we move forward and continue to get, better information and better guidance from the state as far as how to account for things like home occupations. I think it's just providing that and being able to point to that within our goals and policies that we do encourage these things, and we are looking to accommodate some of our projected employment growth and account for trends as far as more people, at least, if not working fully remote, working hybrid schedules. And so it's more kind of a support policy as opposed to probably an absolute employment capacity policy, but it's something I think that we can build upon and continue to point to.
Yeah, I think it would certainly be of interest because, if you have a CPA who's self-employed, works from his house, does it all online, that could potentially push down the requirement for other rezones elsewhere in the city if you have enough people doing that kind of work.
Yeah, and we get our numbers from the state as far as employment data. So if more and more people are doing that, if it's somebody that's a CPA that, their registered address for their business is their home, then yeah, that's going to be reflected in the state employment data. If it's somebody that works for Microsoft and works at home 4 days out of the week or even 5 days out of the week, it's still going to show an address in Bellevue as far as where they work.
Sure.
So. All right, so kind of moving on, continuing with the land use policies. So There was one goal in policy, goal 2.7, that was kind of very prescriptive related to the area off of Highway 92 that just didn't really seem appropriate for a comprehensive plan. So as part of our general review of the goals and policies, we think that we have adequate language within our development code that addresses things like that, that this is really not something that's so appropriate for a comprehensive plan, goal, or policy. So we are proposing to strike that. And then a lot of the remaining changes are specifically related to sustainability and climate change. So things like building out our active transportation network, which has some redundancy with some of the transportation and capital facilities policies, kind of a higher level policy related to implementing the climate sustainability plan. And then basically just incorporating kind of best available science and practices as far as considering the potential impacts of climate change during the planning and review process. So a lot of that is kind of being driven at the state level, and then being reflected in updated building codes and land use codes and land use requirements. So a lot of this stuff is coming down the pipeline from the state, but just basically recognizing our climate sustainability plan and some of the actions that can be incorporated into the comprehensive plan. So those are the major changes to the land use goals and policies, which are attachment 1. So if there aren't any additional questions at this point, I can kind of go into the housing policies, which there are probably a larger number of proposed changes. So we've tried to kind of categorize these into a couple different, obviously general categories. One is, expanding housing options, obviously, to provide that policy foundation. We're already required to implement and be, House Bills 1110 and 1337, but again, just providing that policy foundation and recognizing the importance of providing this variety of housing types, because we do have a documented need, primarily at at least about 60% of our projected housing need is for housing types other than detached single-family residences, which has kind of dominated the land use and housing framework and landscape here in Lake Stevens, basically, for several decades. And so just providing that policy foundation for meeting current and future housing needs at all income levels, specifically for 1220 compliance, allowing a variety of middle housing types in all residential zoning districts, with the caveat that there are some kind of differences. And there has been some previous planning efforts that say waterfront residential, because of the lack of infrastructure and kind of being right up against the lake and having a critical area with the wetland kind of lining the entirety of the lake, that it is treated a little bit differently. So, specifically within the land use policies, it refers to limited middle housing opportunities within waterfront residential, as opposed to kind of a wider variety within some of the other land use designations. And then identifying just basically strategies to increase our multifamily residential within sub areas. That's something that's called out, and just encouraging more mixed use projects, either horizontal or vertical mixed use. We're still seeing a lot of just commercial development, or a lot of, we do have some in the pipeline that are mixed use, but we haven't seen a whole lot of that. So just basically continuing to encourage that as a way to meeting both our employment and our housing growth target needs. A number of policies related to addressing affordability, primarily in goals 3.1 and 3.2. So exploring updates to the city's MFTE program, so multifamily tax exemption program. So, the potential refinements there are some tweaks that can be made to, encourage or incentivize additional provision of affordable housing, especially. Identifying city-owned property with potential to provide affordable housing if we have excess or surplus property. Looking at ways, the city is not an affordable housing developer. We're not going to be building this ourselves, but basically what types of support can the city provide if we have either surplus land or ways to otherwise incentivize affordable housing. So providing that policy foundation. And then providing expedited permitting to projects that have an affordable housing component. Those are the types of things that the city does have some control over. as opposed to, we're not going to be requiring anyone to build affordable housing. We can just put the policies and programs in place to encourage their development. Kind of going along with the sustainability and climate change, goal 3.3 includes a number of new and revised policies, kind of modifying the focus of that planned residential development policy to really focus on protecting critical areas. I would just point out, kind of messed up the numbering within goal 3.3, so we're going to fix that. We forgot 3.3.1. Everybody forgets 3.3.1. And then also implementing strategies and actions from the climate sustainability plan, and then working with partners to incentivize solar panels, charging stations. Again, things that we're not necessarily going to be doing as a city, but where we have some opportunities to build partnerships or incentivize this in a way to meet some of our climate related goals. And then just wanted to speak specifically to some of the language that's being thrown around regarding permanent supportive housing and emergency housing. So this is really coming out of House Bill 1220 from 2021. So goal 3.2 includes some new policies related to these state requirements. So emergency housing, which is more like beds or shelters, as opposed to permanent housing, if there's an emergent need for that, that the city, basically the state law, the growth management as amended by House Bill 1220 requires those to be permitted in all zones where hotels are permitted. So that's primarily within our commercial zones. And then permanent supportive housing, which is kind of that housing that's integrated with support services for primarily documented disabilities, are required to be allowed in all zones, either where hotels are allowed or where residential uses are allowed. So that's pretty much most of the city. And so just providing that policy foundation. And then one of the other components of specifically related to emergency housing is eliminating impact fees, so that parks or traffic impact fees are not required for emergency housing proposals. And then just a little bit more on some of the requirements of House Bill 1220. So racially disparate impacts, the city is required to do kind of a cursory racially disparate impacts analysis, and then develop some goals and policies to address maybe either the zoning framework or some of the policies and programs that have been in place that have resulted in racially disparate impacts, basically differences between primarily non-Hispanic white households versus minority households. So if you look back through some of the documentation, those graphics, which are kind of hard to read at this size, but basically show some of the disparities between, based off of race and ethnicity. If you look at housing cost burden, so basically households that are either housing cost burden, which means that you're spending more than 30% of your income towards housing costs and utilities. And then if you're at about 50%, you're considered extremely housing cost burdened. So really it's that extremely housing cost burden where there's or actually at the housing cost burden where there's about a 16% or what is it? Yeah, 16% difference between minority households and non-minority households. So basically developing the policy language and committing to exploring the root causes of that in more detail. Basically, the comprehensive plan serves to provide that policy foundation. So that's included in there. And then policy 3.2.10. So that's policy 3.2.10. And then kind of identifying potential risks of displacement. As we project all this growth and as we start to look at potential map amendments, we also need to be considering potential impacts of displacement on existing residents and businesses. So added in policy language there. And that is something that as we, continue to consider these, we're obviously a lot of the map amendments are focused primarily on providing housing opportunities at these lower income ranges, but more so as we're looking at other, proposed land use map amendments or rezones, privately initiated, basically having that policy foundation within the comprehensive plan that if we are considering this, that if there's a supply of naturally affordable housing, unregulated affordable housing, that would potentially be impacted by a rezone or something else, we need to be factoring that into our decision-making process. And that's what this policy provides the foundation for. And so that is the end of the policy language. So basically what we're looking for tonight, and I appreciate the comments so far, and we have plenty of time for additional comments, either from commissioners or from the public. Basically just reviewing the draft land use and housing goals and policies, providing your initial feedback, identifying additional topics or areas that we need to be focusing on before we generate the complete draft of the comprehensive plan and put that out for public and agency review later this summer. If you have additional questions about the projected growth targets or the map amendments that have been discussed tonight, happy to go over those. And then, yeah, just in general, any additional topics that you think need to be incorporated into the housing and land use elements. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
I have two, if I could refer back to our last attachment number 2, 3.1.8. Actually wrote it down. Makes it a whole lot easier. And you hit on this, but I wanted to revisit it. The tax exemptions, explore programs such as multifamily tax exemptions. We discussed tax exemptions. I can't remember which iteration of this. But it was, if you build so many, you get a break on taxes, or it's deferred for a bit of time or whatever. What does the multifamily tax exemption program look like now? In a nutshell, not in its
Do you
vast.
tackle that one, or you? know that?
Yeah, you guys can tackle it or.
Yeah, so we have a multifamily tax exemption that was adopted by city council a number of years ago. Essentially, there's an 8-year, and I want to say a 12-year
12-year.
program. And the 8-year is purely market driven, and the 12-year has an affordability component. So if the city is going to give you a property tax break for 12 years, you have to provide affordable housing. As the MFTE program has evolved in the state landscape, it's really going away from providing any type of tax exemption without an affordability. So if we're looking beyond what we can do in a zoning capacity with real property, availability of real property, that is something we can offer, that we can alter our 8-year program and make our 8-year program also have an affordability component. So that would be, if at a policy level we make any recommendations, it would have probably tiered affordability. So if you go to a 12-year, you're going to have to provide this much affordability. If you do an 8-year tax exemption, this is what you have to do. So
How much has that been utilized?
we've had one project apply for that.
That's been, I'm trying to think of when we discussed that.
It's been a while.
It's been a while. The other question, that I'll be brief, is 3.2.1. Avoid the concentration of supportive and affordable housing in limited areas of the city. Some clustering talks about affordable housing may be appropriate within proximity to public transportation. Avoid the concentration of supportive and affordable housing in limited areas of the city. And I just, again, reading it, there's some ambiguity there. And I don't know how to change it to be more specific, but I didn't know what exactly it was trying to accomplish.
I think we should probably create more parity between that and the zoning regulations, where we're really not referring to concentrations, because all we can limit is where it's allowed, which is in commercial zones, some residential zones. And then I think the tag on at the end in proximity to public services is good. But I would agree that we probably need to update that from what we were trying to reflect 10 years ago when the prior policy language was created.
Thank you. It just read wonky.
Okay.
Ma'am, did you have a comment? Yeah. Yeah, if you don't mind stepping up to the podium again. Thank you.
Janice Thompson. Hey, I wondered if the commissioners have read these House bills.
As much as I
Everybody-
could
Much,
stomach
yeah.
them, yes.
Okay. I know it's not good read, but I just am hoping that all the commissioners did read these bills. I don't believe we have the roads. I don't think we have the roads to be able to support this, whether the state wants to mandate it or try to dictate it. Not to mention the trestle. I mean, I can't believe that you can't go back and go, we can't meet these housing needs for these reasons. And if nothing else, push them into fixing the trestle. There's just, I mean, I look at I-5, well, I drive I-5. There's nowhere to get to Lake Stevens besides the trestle, unless you want to do the rest of the trek to Marysville. So I just don't see where the state, it's all good in theory, what they're trying to say, but anyway, I don't see where the roads are there. And that will be one of the questions that I'll have for you when I have an opportunity. I thought I'd come to this meeting first to see where are we doing the widening projects within Lake Stevens? Where are we adding the roads in Lake Stevens just for us to move around here, not to mention trying to get off of I-5 and home. Let's see here. Oh, the affordable housing. I think it needs to be incorporated into rich neighborhoods. Poor people and rich people can live together. Will always be the haves and the have-nots and the ones in the middle. Our kids all go to school together. They know who's poor, and the poor kids know who the rich kids are. I don't know why we can't incorporate this housing smaller size. I mean, you got these 3,000 square foot houses. Why can't there be smaller homes in there? It's healthier for children to be around people maybe that are more affluent. And it's kind of nice for the rich kids to learn how the poor kids. I mean, that's kind of how I was raised, and we were all the same. It just didn't matter. So I wish we would incorporate and not create areas like we had in the past where you would go through there and it was just the saddest state of affair from the time that you would drive into that neighborhood. It's like, everybody has to maintain their properties, but I wish we would try to make an effort to incorporate that into into each neighborhood and I don't know how that can be done, but kids will benefit from it as well as adults for that matter. The employment needs, the road widening, let me see, the amendments to the GMA. I think that pretty much covers it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Is there a precedent for, I think of my neighborhood, there are big houses and then there are ranchers, right? 1,100, 1,200 square foot ranches that are prized. Like, if we could get one for my mother and father-in-law today we would. But is there precedent in the current building code that would require, in addition to the 3,500 square foot houses that are being built next to each other, a mix of smaller homes with comparatively, smaller price tags on them?
Well, that's already a component of our middle housing program that's already in our zoning code that does give preference and some bonuses if people want to develop smaller properties. So we already have adopted some tools, and that's really the point of all of this middle housing toolkit that's come from Olympia and allowing different housing types in different neighborhoods. I mean, that is the sole purpose, is to have integrated neighborhoods. Going beyond that, if you really wanted in new neighborhoods, a dramatic mix that would really get pushed towards inclusionary zoning, which there is a mandate to create. You do so many of this, you have to do so many of this, and that's not been somewhere that I think this community has been willing to go
Oh,
to
sure.
this point, but that
Right.
also could be something, we have another conversation about if that's the direction the community is headed or not.
Are developers taking those incentives up to build, considerably smaller,
No.
housing units?
No.
Right. And that's like what kind of feedback perhaps might you be hearing that would provide incentive enough for them to build, just not, I mean, 3,500 square feet is that's a lot of house. For a family of four, that's a lot of house. 1,200, 1,500 square foot properties is what level of incentive is there?
Yeah, not enough. I mean, that.
Not, right,
Not
okay.
enough. National builders, they have a not defending or advocating, but they have a tried and true model that
Oh,
they
sure.
follow. They follow the market trends, so they're going to work on the averages of the market. And, that's just it. It's a free market for them, and that's what they follow versus, in this case, where a city would be creating mandates to make them develop in a different way. So, I mean, it's just a difference in philosophy. Some communities
Yeah.
do that. This one has not historically. And we have had incentives in place for lots of years to do different types of housing, whether it's the tax exemption, whether it's additional floor height for buildings, et cetera. And again, people go back to what's tried and true in the market that they build and stick to that.
That's it.
Yeah, we've had a cottage housing code for a
20
good amount of years, and it basically allows you to double the density, and I don't know if it's ever been utilized. So, and to be honest, I mean, I think with some of the recent changes to state law, and especially with 1337, is if you can get up to 1,000 square foot ADU, that's basically this almost the size of what people would call a cottage, then people are it just seems the development community is more likely to continue to build the 2,500 to 3,500 square foot houses, make the lot big enough that they can put a couple of detached ADUs and then condominiumize those and sell them off, as opposed to developing cottage housing. So, and I think that's still, it's a smaller unit. It's still going to be much more affordable, obviously, than the primary structure. But I think that's, from my read of what's happening already, is that that's more likely to happen as opposed to cottage housing.
Was there any feedback for David tonight on the map amendments? I know we heard a little bit earlier. I didn't hear lots of objections to the proposals, just to make sure that as we go to the next phase of this, that we are notifying people and trying to provide some education, but I really didn't hear a lot of concerns about what's being proposed.
I think those map amendments look fine. I think they make sense. And those additional options that you pointed out, like on 20th, that business district, we discussed that. I think those all make sense too. So I would agree with that.
Okay.
All those.
All right. Thank you.
All right. With that, we'll go to the commissioners' reports. Start with Commissioner Morton.
I will not be available on July 15th, so I will ask to be excused for the next meeting.
Right. Bruce?
And that's all.
Thank you. Commissioner Dewar?
I just had a quick question. As I recall, there was an entry for the solicitor code that we were going to be looking at this year. I've noticed a substantial uptick in the number of solicitors hitting up my place, and I was just curious when and if we plan on bringing that back for discussion.
It will not be coming back to the planning commission, but it is scheduled to go in front of the city council in the next meeting or two. I don't remember the exact date, but it is going back to the city
Before
council.
their break.
Yeah, before their break.
Nothing for me.
And I just want to add on to one of my previous comments. Our neighbors in the light industrial district are lovely. It is not a pot production, anti-Janice Huxford conversation. It just, the odor is what is, I was wanting to refer to. So if I can make sure that I am not saying anything against our neighbors in a public meeting, I want to make sure that I do that.
And I don't have anything this evening. Commissioner Holt?
Yeah, unfortunately, my mother-in-law, my husband's mom passed away on June 4th. She was 95 years old and my husband was with her and she took her last breath and passed away. And so, yeah, she just turned 95 on February 13th. And so we had to clean everything out of her apartment from Ashley Point. And so my husband's quite sad because his dad passed away in September of 2016 and now his mom's passed away. So we have her ashes and now we're just trying to figure out when we're gonna do like a memorial service for him.
Certainly our condolences, Commissioner Holt. Right, and brings us to the planning director's report.
I didn't have a specific report tonight, but I'm happy to answer any questions that the commission may have about what's going on in the city right now, if I know.
Oh, and then all
Questions?
of our,
Oh.
wait a minute, all of our meetings in July and August will be on Mondays, right?
Yes.
Yeah, sticking them on.
So our next meeting then is July 15th. Because July 1st was canceled, right?
That's correct.
So yeah, actually question about Lake Stevens Community Park and Caballero. I know that there's discussion of the county ceding that to, or, you know, for that to turn hands over to the city. Where in the process is that currently?
It's still really in just a discussion phase. It hasn't gone beyond that.
Okay. All right. That's all I had.
Well, I saw that the mayor put out a speech today and there's a slideshow also. I have not looked at that yet, so I don't have any questions. But I'm glad the city's, reporting out things like that. And it'd be great if that had wider distribution. I don't know how, but I encourage everybody to get on the email list on the city. It's you get all kinds of notices on everything there.
Yeah, the mayor will be at the Association of Washington Cities is what he's referring to, and part of a panel discussion. And I'm pretty familiar with some of the slides he'll be presenting.
It's great.
Good job, Russ.
All right. With that, we have a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
I'll second it.
All in favor?
Aye.
All right. Thank you so much.
Next week.
I